back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things pertaining to the Christian faith. That's for Brian, because Brian's a language snob. So we're saying pertaining because he thinks it means something. Anyway, today's is a little bit different episode. We're so excited for you to be a part of that. But before we jump into this episode, in this intro, we wanted to give you a little bit of context that will help you as you listen to this episode, because it's a very special conversation. Yeah. But we felt like a little bit of context would help you as you listen here.
Yeah. So a few weeks back, we had the privilege to talk to John Castelein about his testimony, and very particularly, not just his testimony in general, although he gives us a good deal of it, but particularly it's about his walking away from the Christian faith, and then also the story of what it was that brought him back to faith. It's a bit of a longer episode, but trust me, you're going to want to listen to this whole thing. It's moving. I'll just say this: at the end of it, I said to Ryan, "This is the best thing we've ever done," and of course, his comment was,
"Well, we didn't talk much, so of course, it's better than what we usually do." So, with that said, we wanted to let John just tell his story. So there's not as much of the give and take. So if you don't like us, but you still listen to us, you're really going to love this. But he begins way back with his family origins. But I think you're going to find that story really intriguing, because it really sets the narrative of where things go from there.
And his family has a pretty wild story.
Yes,
really.
And you may think as you're listening, like, why is this relevant information? But stick with it, because it's all relevant as you listen through this.
So let me tell you a little bit about. We're going to introduce John Castelein in the interview itself, but all three of us, Ryan and myself and John, all have Lincoln Christian College and Seminary in common. Ryan was a student there, and John and I both taught there at the same time. We were colleagues together. He taught in the seminary. I primarily taught in the college. So you'll hear John reference during this interview some names that will not be familiar to you. Most of them are like professors or people that we know in the community, that kind of thing. They're mostly connected to the school somehow. But again, within context, I think you'll be able to figure out these are just people that we have in common. And as you'll also hear, John was a professor of theology for decades.
Yes.
So he understands theological concepts very well, and he uses some language and will mention some names of theologians, some scholars that may not be familiar to you. But again, with context, I think you can pick most of that up. In fact, it led me to think that maybe we should do later on an episode on some of the different topics we talk about. But just hang in there. He's a theology professor for decades, and so he's going to use some of that specialized language.
Yeah. And as Brian mentioned, probably one of the best episodes we've had. Yeah. We're really excited for you to listen to this. Stick with it. Listen to the conversation. We think you're really going to enjoy it. And then Brian and I will come back at the very end and kind of wrap some stuff up. So we're going to jump right into this conversation. We're just going to drop right in. So here we go.
We have a guest with us. We're very pleased to have John Castelein with us. John, when I worked down at Lincoln, he was a professor in the seminary, theology professor there. He didn't solicit this, but I'm going to say one of the most intelligent people I've ever had conversation with and opportunity to sit with. And we're very pleased that he's come. He's going to share a bit of his story, though. It's what he's going to be talking about today. And we're very thrilled, John, that you've agreed to do this, and thank you so much for coming on to the episode. I do want to say we're being hosted today. It's neat to be in person with the Bistro. We're being hosted by the Guest House in Lincoln, Illinois. Ethan Honicke is the proprietor there, and he's graciously allowed us to use this facility. So thank you very much, Ethan. Great coffee that he has. If you're ever in the tea. There you go. Now, what's the name of the tea you have, John? Hippie tea. Okay.
It's a hippie tea, and it's really good.
Okay, it's good stuff. Well, and we got a Chemex. So if you're ever in the greater Lincoln Metroplex and you're looking for a cup of coffee, the Guest House, it's a nice facility. He does a nice job right downtown. Yeah. Well, John, we've invited you here because of your testimony to an extent. In fact, I was on campus. I think it was a little over a year ago that I was on campus, and you came up to me and told me a little bit of your story. And after that, Paul Boatman, another professor from Lincoln, former professor from Lincoln, had interviewed you, and it was published in the Christian Standard. And I read that with interest. And then you told a little bit of your testimony in a commencement address, and people have really responded to that. And then you told me that you've also done this on a podcast, both in English and in Dutch. You had it translated into Dutch. And so that's why we've asked you here to hear a bit more about that story and to just share it with our listeners.
It wasn't translated. I spoke it.
Spoken Dutch.
That's before I learned English. That was my native tongue.
Mother tongue. Huh?
And the people who are listening to this or watching this, they're going to be able to pick up on a slight accent. I was married for 53 years to a Kentuckian.
Oh, okay.
And that knocked some of the accent out of there. So there might be a little Southern accent mixed in. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm glad to share my story, and I'm going to be talking to you guys, but indirectly to whoever's watching or viewing or so. I am a strange bird because my mother was French and my father was Belgian, and I was born in France with dual nationality. So I was both French due to birth and mother, and also Belgian citizen. And this is all in 1948. That's the year I was born. So the war had just ended. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that because that really plays it's odd how the past plays a significant role in our present and even in our future.
Yeah.
When the Germans, for the second time, wanted to attack France, they had to come through Belgium. And so they invaded Belgium in World War II. And my father did not want to be drafted by the Germans. He was a young man. He was dating a French lady, and he did not want to help the Germans. So he went into what's called the resistance. He went underground. So they came and got my grandfather and said, "You're going to work for us," because Donald, my dad, Donald, or Daniel, as they called him. My dad was actually born in England.
Oh, really?
Right. But of a British mother and an English father.
Oh, okay.
And did I say that right? A Belgian father and an English mother.
Said British.
Well,
I got what you're saying.
You guys are intimidating me.
Oh my gosh! No.
No, my grandfather was wounded in Flanders Fields, famous poem, but not in World War I. It was in World War II. And he was transported to England, where a British nurse fell in love with him. They married, and my dad was born on Newcastle-on-Tyne and lived there for 2 years. So he was raised English. His mom spoke English. And then Grandpa, the Belgian, decided to come back to Belgium. So my father already was somewhat of a mixed breed, and because he spoke English, his mother made sure he knew English. Right. But then he also spoke Dutch, Flemish, as we call it, Flemish, Vlaams. So he married this French girl, and in World War II, the Germans came for him, and Dad was hiding, and he felt, I got to turn myself in. I can't let my grandfather, go through whatever they want to do. And he turned himself in, and Mom volunteered. She told the captain of the Germans, she said, "If you will let us get married," because they were dating. She said, "If you will let us get married, I'll voluntarily go in this work camp, not a concentration camp, but a work camp. I will go with him and serve in a work camp, and you'll have another worker for free." So that's how Mom and Dad met and got married and lived in Germany for a while. When they came back from Germany, the Americans had already landed at Normandy, come all the way across to that part of France, and so they came into a liberated France and decided not to go back to Germany. And this is a name I know you will know. I'm not so sure about you.
I probably won't. Yes, I'm sure.
But Dad spoke English because he had a British mother. He was fluent in Flemish. He was a Belgian citizen. He's married to a French woman, so he's fluent in French. But he also spoke German, 4 languages. Exactly the kind of guy the Americans needed. They were looking for a translator. Okay. And so they assigned him to work with a guy named Don Sharp.
Okay. Yeah.
That name ring a bell?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
At one time, he preached here in Lincoln, Illinois.
Okay.
But at that time, he was not a Christian. And so Don Sharp and Don Castelein became really good friends. And they worked together. As soon as the war was done, Don Sharp came back to America, and they promised we'll write each other, exchange addresses and all that. Don Sharp's letter was returned almost immediately. Oui, cité de Bétigny, all France, address inconnue, address unknown. So he could communicate with my dad.
Right.
Address was unknown. And my dad did the Castelein thing. He just lost Sharp's address. So this is true. 1945, Don Sharp was back in America. 1951, Mom was cleaning out some cabinets, and a drawer was stuck. So she yanked on it, and out popped a little note with Don Sharp's address on it.
Oh my goodness.
So my dad wrote a typical Castelein letter. He said, it was Christmas time, so he says, I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and hope you are doing well if you're still alive.
Is that a Castelein thing?
That's the logic is impeccable. So Don Sharp wrote back to him and said, yeah, not only am I still alive, but I'm doing very well. And I'm actually in near Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm at a school called Johnson Bible College.
Bible College. Okay. Huh.
And I'm studying for the ministry. And my dad wrote back and said, oh, I am so impressed. Is this for the Ministry of Finances, the Ministry of Education?
Right.
He had no idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So Don wrote him back and said, no, this is for the ministry of the gospel. I'm going to be a preacher. Well, he brought the letters of my dad to their missions group that met regularly on campus. And Floyd Clark is a name from Johnson Bible College, a very famous dean at the school. He headed it up. And eventually he said to Don Sharp, this guy shows interest and we need to witness to him. The students on campus took up an offering and sent Don Sharp on the Queen Mary all the way to France to witness to my parents.
Wow.
To witness to one couple.
Wow.
That's incredible.
I never tell that without getting choked up.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It wasn't a tribe or a nation. It was just a friend, So almost within no time at all, to hear Don Sharp talk about it, he's written this up and it's been published, how God converted my parents. He was doing Acts, let's see, the Ethiopian eunuch, Acts chapter 7, 8, 9, I think.
I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
And my dad asked him, just like the Ethiopian eunuch, what hinders me from being baptized? So mom was not ready because she didn't understand English that well. So that night, without even being converted or baptized or anything, Dad was evangelizing my mom.
Okay.
Wow.
And the next morning, she got up to him and said, Mr. Sharp, I want to be baptized too. So they went downtown to a goldfish pond.
Oh, wow.
And they were immersed there. And now, I've heard Don Sharp say this, and I trust Don Sharp. He was my mentor. He was really a great friend of the family. But he said there were workers on a roof nearby, and at that time, Olivan was very communist.
Right.
In fact, my grandparents were communists. My grandfather died a communist, both my grandmother and grandfather. So they knew nothing about the church except bad stuff. And they were wondering, what are these foreigners doing to our citizens? They're drowning them downtown.
In the goldfish pond.
In the goldfish pond. So in 1942, Dad entered himself. He came to Johnson Bible College to enter the ministry, and then the family joined him a little bit later.
52.
52, right? What did I say?
42.
42. We're intimidating. Sorry.
Yeah, you're right. The more I can get you to laugh, the more relaxed I
Okay,
am.
all right. Well, we can laugh.
We can laugh.
Our listeners know that.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, the war is over. 1945 to 51, no contact, then contact, and then conversion. And then my dad said he felt a calling to the ministry, so he went to Johnson.
So how old were you at that?
I was 4 years old,
4,
1948.
Okay.
When I was born. So 4
So
years old.
family picks up and moves.
Right. I had a brother, Don, who's still living, named after my dad. And he's 71 now. No, he's 72. I'm 75. He'll soon turn 73. 4 years at Johnson Bible College, and Dad is very well received. He did not have a high school degree.
Oh, okay.
So he did, what do you call that? When you do it by
A general education degree, a GED.
GED,
Okay, GED,
that's it. He
okay.
did the GED.
Oh, okay.
So he graduated from high school and from the college. I think valedictorian.
Really?
Right.
Okay.
And preached at the Mountain View Church of Christ, and that was a good experience. And then in 1958, we returned to 1956. I'm sorry, we returned to Belgium. I was 8 years old. And we returned to, actually, Dad started French Christian Mission to start a work in France because that's where they had lived and all that. But as it turned out, there was a Baptist who was open to the New Testament position on baptism and other things. Sure. And so we wound up actually in Genk, Genk, Belgium, in the northern part of Belgium, right across from the German border and from the Holland border. There's a little triangle there. Sorry, my nose is itchy. You guys be so intimidated. My nose.
I'll be honest, that's the first time someone says, "You're making me nervous. I'm going to itch my nose."
So Genk, my hometown, I consider it my hometown, is right up close to Holland and close to Germany. It's right in the corner in the province of Limburg. And that's where the church was started. Okay. But before too long, there was a break with the Baptists, and Dad got support from America. He was sent as a missionary and started the very first Christian church in Belgium.
Belgium, wow. Yeah.
Right. And I was his first baptizee, the first person he baptized. December 29, the day before my 9th birthday. So I was baptized at age 8. 1 day short of 9, but I was his first person that he immersed, baptized in the school met the Bible, in the school with the Bible, a Protestant school for kids. So anyhow, to move ahead, from 1956 to 1966, I was in Belgium. Dutch is the language. I did have English in school, 3 years of English, 3 years of German, 6 years of French. I mean, because Belgium is bilingual, so we had to know French.
And you didn't speak, you spoke what in the home? What?
We spoke Dutch.
Dutch in the home?
No
Okay.
English, no. I learned my English from TV, believe it or not.
I
really
believe it.
did.
I've heard that before, yeah.
Star Trek. Not Star Trek. Mission Impossible.
Yeah. For the young listeners, that's not the one with Tom Cruise. That's the original.
No. I'm trying to think of the shows, but here's the thing. In the Flemish part of Belgium, they broadcast in English with Dutch subtitles. Yeah. In the French part, they dub it all into French, in the Walloon part of Belgium. But in my part, they actually showed it in English. And so, what is I Spy?
Oh, yeah, right.
You know? So quite a few of those shows were broadcast, and that's where I really picked up English, but not written English, spoken English. Right. I found out when I myself went to Johnson, I found out that my written English left a lot to be desired. Now, here's where it really gets to the meat of the product. You need to know about Don Sharp, how he converted my family, and he's the one who brought us over and set us up. But in the meantime, in Belgium's a very secular culture with a great Roman Catholic history. Okay. But very few people really, percentage-wise, very few people attend church. It's just the beautiful domes, structures, cathedrals, but the people don't go to church.
Right.
And so there are very few Protestants. And the Protestants, even though it has a Catholic background, the culture is very secular.
Right.
In school, religion is mandatory, still is in Belgium. So I had Protestant teachers in school, and they were not Bible believing in the sense that conservatives would be today.
Right.
One was really a Bultmannian. That'll ring a bell with you, Brian.
Yeah.
The other guy was a Barthian.
Okay.
For those who know a little bit of theology,
Rudolf Bultmann and
Karl Barth.
and Karl Barth. And these guys, in other words, the Bible is not literally true. And that's what my dad was basically preaching, historically true, accurate. I don't know if Dad would have called it inerrant or not, but, the Bible was true.
Yeah.
And what happened is I was baptized at age 8, but in high school, these guys kept raising questions. And the culture was very seductive and all that, very non-religious. And I lost my faith.
Okay.
By the time I was 14, I had to go to church. Dad was the preacher and the missionary. And I actually did taping. We recorded the services and took him to shut-ins. But it's odd to say, but as a child in a preacher's family, I already had said, this is just for people not well educated. Look at my Protestant teachers. One guy reads Hebrew.
Right.
Nace, Jan Nace, Domine Nace. Domine means preacher. He was a very educated man, very smart, and he raised all kinds of questions. And so I kind of, in my mind, made a very important lifelong decision that if you're really educated, you're not going to follow this, I didn't know the word, but I would have said fundamentalist trait.
Right.
So then in 1965, something dramatic happened in my life. I'm still in Belgium. I'm going to school. I'm in my last year of high school, and my father dies very unexpectedly of a heart attack.
Wow.
We just knew that he was having some chest pains and some shortness of breath when he would exercise, but he was 44 years old. That's and basically I've not had any problems. But one evening he went to visit a neighbor and just dropped dead.
Wow.
And he was gone like that. Well, that was my first wake-up call. That was my first delinquency, my first turn away from the faith, and also my first coming back to the faith. What happened is, Dad's death really upset me. In Belgium at that time, corpses were left in the homes until funeral time. And so you put airwick out, but they did not go to a funeral home. So I saw my dad every morning, and was faced with the reality of his death. And in my mind, it caused a spiritual crisis. And I remember this very vividly. This is we were talking about spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
This is my first.
Okay.
I couldn't sleep, and I was troubled. And I came downstairs and found the Bible. I hadn't read the Bible, for myself in quite a while. So I'm 16 years old, find the Bible, sit down at a little past midnight, and start reading Matthew 14.
Okay.
Jesus walking on the water.
Yeah.
And guys, that scripture came alive to me like no preacher had ever made it come alive. I was in the boat. My life was in a whole turmoil. I was in the midst of a storm, and Jesus was speaking to me, and he says, "Come. It is I. Do not be afraid." And I had to make a decision. Now, am I going to trust this? I'm just a kid.
Right.
But am I going to trust this illusory security that I have? Or am I going to venture back into the faith and with this Jesus that, I don't really know? And, I cried out, "It's a ghost." That's what the disciples said. But I decided, no, I'm going to trust him. And I consciously remember recommitting. And so, following that, the Americans sent a missionary to take my dad's place, Milton Duhan, who was a Cajun Christian from Louisiana. And
Did he bring his accordion down with him?
no, he didn't. But here's the deal. Remember what I told you? Belgium's divided between the Dutch and the Walloons.
Yeah.
They hate each other. If it wasn't for Brussels, the country was tried time and time again to split between the Dutch and the Walloon-speaking people.
Yeah.
You know what they speak in Louisiana?
French Creole.
Creole,
Yeah.
French.
Yeah.
And Milton could speak French, of course. So he thought he'd try it out. In the Dutch-speaking part of Genk, North, that didn't work real well. So on Sunday mornings, I was in the pulpit translating him into Dutch. And that really helped my English too. Right. But at the same time that I was going through this revival, I decided I too wanted to be a preacher. And I myself went to Johnson Bible College. In 1966, I entered Johnson.
I have a question for you.
Why, sure.
Yeah. So you have this renewal of faith, but you're still in it. You're still in the school system, and you have these Bultmannian, this is all a myth and so forth. Like, so how did your eyes change when you went back to school? If you were still in that education piece of you knew what you had experienced, you placed your faith in Christ, but then you were still in this culture that was trying to push you away.
Right. There were two. That's it, Ryan. That's a good question. I have not thought about that last year in high school. Now that I'm thinking back on it, there were two attacks on my faith. One was philosophical, religious, and the other one was cultural, moral. And so now I'm a Christian. I'm facing my senior year in high school. How did I deal with this? Because those challenges are still there.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a tough question to answer because my teachers did not change and the culture did not change.
Right.
But my heart had been touched. And at that time, I fell in with a conservative Christian group that was charismatic. And it made sense to me. I was reading Grant Osborne. I don't think it's Grant Osborne. Some kind of like a Oral Roberts, his literature.
Yeah.
But I read some, but there was an Osborne guy that I read and some others. And I wound up speaking in tongues. And that formed like a shield around me, a shield of faith, a conservative shield of faith. So I did not engage my teachers because I remember my history professor was very secular also. I did not engage the religion professors or the history professors. I just let them say what they said, but it no longer penetrated. I kind of like had a shield of faith. And I was very involved in ministry. I went calling with Milton Duhan, this Cajun preacher. And so my senior year was not a hassle. And so I was at Johnson. And I had to really learn learn the culture. I didn't play baseball. I didn't play basketball. We didn't have sports in high school at all. It was all academic.
Right.
No band. Everything that you have here for high school kids, we don't have that in Belgium. Well, maybe they do now, but
they did that, right?
Yeah. But then it was just all study, homework, and then study. So anyhow, my first 2 years at Johnson were kind of rough because I really had to academically. I was a smart enough kid, but English was a challenge and everything written and all that. So just like when I went to Belgium at age 8, I had to learn the Dutch language from scratch, basically. And the kids would fetch my exams or my papers out of the trash can and pass them around like, can you believe how dumb this kid is?
To make fun of you.
Oh, yeah, because the teacher would give a test and, I failed it because I let alone understand her, I sure could not answer what she was asking.
Right.
So I've often been on the other side, where I don't fit into the culture, not Dutch or American really. But to come back to Johnson Bible College, as soon as I started studying the Bible, the same critical questions that Bultmann and Barth and my two professors, Dominique Nys and Dominique Overdulve, those questions resurfaced again.
Yeah.
The school frowned on speaking in tongues and the whole charismatic thing. And once again, it didn't take too long for me to start really thinking, what am I doing here in this fundamentalist school?
Okay.
And by then I knew the fundamentalist vocabulary and mindset and all that. My salvation came from Francis Schaeffer. I was reading him, The God Who Is There.
Yeah.
He had not come out with How Should We Then Live yet, but Escape from Reason.
Yeah, Escape from Reason, The God Who's There, and He is There, and He is Not Silent.
Those three.
We've talked about the trilogy. In my opinion, the finest books that
Well,
Schaeffer
they
wrote.
really kept me in the faith already because I was already losing ground.
They were important
and
for
the
me as
reason
well.
I was losing ground was because I was an inquisitive student.
And I'm thinking, I taught college age New Testament for years, and my thought is you would have a grounding in Bultmann and Barth, where that's something that I would be the one who would introduce people to that, just to that. But you were hearing it from the people from a very young age.
Here's the deal. I didn't hear the names Bultmann and Barth, but the ideas, God did not inspire. Yeah, it was demythologizing.
It was a part of the social imaginary, to use a Charles Taylor.
Right.
Yeah,
Charles Taylor.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But Francis Schaeffer helped me a lot. My mom got on the outs with Johnson Bible College, totally unrelated to me, but she drew me out of school. I was just an 18, 19-year-old kid. I didn't know how to drive. I had not watched any American TV except for what I watched in Belgium. Didn't know the culture, none of that stuff. So I was really ignorant. My mom said, "You're either coming back to Belgium, or you have to go to another school. You can't stay at Johnson." She fell out with the administration.
Okay.
Well, I had just met a guy from a place called Lincoln, Illinois. And he had been talking about this guy that he says, "John, the questions that you have, this guy can help you." Dr. James D. Strauss.
Yeah.
And so when my mom forced me to leave Johnson, I thought, okay, I'm going to give this Strauss guy a thing. And here, this is just a little side thing, but God has been so providential in my life.
That's what I keep, even as I'm hearing this part of your story, the number of times that it seems to me that God's guidance and direction was on your family and
Listen to this. I mean, this I'm going to cry when I tell you this because it's so the day that my mom kidnapped me from the school with another woman, they said, "Get in the car." And I wanted to stay, but she said, "No, you got to go." And I'm still a kid. She's my mom, So I go with her. And that evening, she decided, you don't want to be with me. You don't want to go to Belgium. You betrayed me, which was not true. So the next day, she takes me in the morning after breakfast. She takes me in this lady's car and drops me off on Chapman Highway, which is a 6-lane highway going to Gatlinburg from Knoxville on that big interstate road, and drops me off, and that's it. She leaves me there. Got my little suitcase. So what do I do? So I call the school and I say, "Can I speak to President Bell?" R.M. Bell was the president at that time.
Which school? Lincoln?
Johnson.
Oh, Johnson. Okay.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, you're still in that Tennessee.
I'm still. I'm going to try to work it out to get to Lincoln, but I'm still a Johnson student,
Yeah.
and I'm in Knoxville, and I'm dropped in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So I called the operator, and she says, "Yeah, I'll connect you with Dr. Bell's office, R.M. Bell. Very famous, prestigious teacher, contributed for years and years and years so much to the growth of Johnson Bible College." And I'm connected with Dr. Bell, and I said, "Dr. Bell, here's what happened. My mom took me away from the campus. I don't want to go back to Belgium. I want to finish my education. She dropped me off on Chapman Highway, and I don't know what to do."
Yeah.
He said, "Oh, I have someone here you want to talk to." And he hands the phone to Don Sharp.
Really?
Wow.
Don had a daughter, Janet, same class as mine. He was there to pick her up.
Wow. That's amazing.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
He took me home. Right.
And he was at Lincoln at the time. Is that or
No.
he wasn't still okay. He
No, he was at
still in Tennessee.
Crawfordsville.
Okay.
Crawfordsville, Indiana.
Indiana. Okay.
But his daughter was at Johnson.
Okay.
And so that's the second time he saved my family. The first time he baptized my parents. Second time he took me home and took care of me. And someone had told me that Lincoln, Illinois, is not too far from Indiana. So even if you don't drive, you can minister in Indiana because that's where I was with Crawfordsville. Well, I was called to a ministry in Valparaiso, Indiana, and I accepted it because I thought, Indiana's not too far from Lincoln. 186 miles without a car. And so I accepted the ministry there, and God worked it out that I talking about Bob Twist, he had a brother, Matt. I don't know if you've ever heard of Matt Twist, but he was a student at the time. And he had a girlfriend in Chicago, so I caught some rides with him. Okay. Caught the train from Chicago to Valpo. But for 2 years, I preached at a little church there, Flint Lake Church of Christ. And in the meantime, studied at Lincoln, got my BA degree. And that was not enough for me, so I wanted seminary work, especially so I could work with Dr. Strauss, right? So I got my MA and my MDiv. And at the very end of that, in 1973, I was having churches ask me to come and preach, to be their preacher. And one church was nearby. I was preaching in Rutland, Illinois. And this church in Streeter, Illinois, Central Church of Christ, wanted me to come. And I'd done some preaching for them, and we got along well. And I said, no, I feel an obligation to my hometown in Schenck. I need to see if I can work in Schenck. In the meantime, I had met a girl in Valpo, Marie Cornett, and we'd been married in 1968. And so we decided to go to Belgium. So in 1974, we raised missionary support and went to my hometown in Schenck, where I told you. Yeah. That did not go real well. It's very hard on my wife. She didn't know the language at all. Sure. And I was having cultural problems as to my identity. Was I Belgian? Was I American? It's, like I said, a very seductive culture, very secular culture. Right. And so we decided it'd be better for us as a couple and as Christians to be back in America. So I came back, finished up my seminary work. And as soon as I was back, in 1976, the school called me and said, we'd like you to come and teach in New Testament. Right. Yeah. And I said, no, I'm just in Streeter. I've only been here 1 year. I can't leave this church now. So the guy that they hired was from Florida, and I forget his name now.
Was it Heine or?
No, New Testament.
It wasn't Doc.
No.
Okay.
No. Is that he was only at the school for 1 year. So a year later, they said, we need a New Testament.
Hey, the job's opened up again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so
interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
You're like, well, I've been at Streeter for 2 years now. I can jump.
Yeah,
I can jump.
Well, by then, I'd had a very successful, honestly, an amazing ministry in Streeter, Illinois. We had, I would say, 2 or 3 that back then people come forward and be baptized. Yeah. I reported to the Standard, Christian Standard, 2 or 3 baptisms every month.
Wow.
Every month.
Yeah, that's
for
great.
The 2 years I was there. It's not that I was that great a preacher, but the Spirit was working in the church.
People were responding.
And, so the church was doing well. But
can I ask you a question?
Well, sure.
So back this time, you come to Lincoln because of Doc Strauss. He's here. So did you feel like you said you still had some of those questions that were kind of hanging around in your mind? So during your time at Lincoln, and you're working through your BA, your MA,
right.
And did you feel
and MDiv
too? Yeah. Did you feel like your questions were being like where was your heart at this time?
Good question. Some of my questions were being answered and had already been answered by Francis Schaeffer.
Sure.
And C.S. Lewis. I was reading C.S. Lewis. And Doc had a lot to offer. But at the same time, some of the questions were actually sharpening and deepening, especially the synoptic questions between the three Gospels and then the three in John.
Yeah.
And then theodicy questions about the fairness of God in the Old Testament. Right. And the transition from Old Testament God of wrath to the New Testament. That's simplifying, but no, the questions. Some of my questions were answered,
but others became sharper and more.
That was an interesting. That's an interesting image. That sharper and deeper.
They penetrated deeper.
Yeah.
And in fact, the school hired me in 1977. Came and lived on campus View Drive, and it was teaching New Testament. It was teaching New Testament Acts. I taught Acts for 10 years.
Okay,
but mostly my largest load was in the IDS program, the humanities program. But the school said, "We want you to get a PhD." So where would you like to go? I had no idea. I never thought of a PhD.
Just for those who don't know, IDS is interdisciplinary studies, and it was kind of a unique program where you'd study various, instead of taking a class in history and one in philosophy, and it was combining all those and kind of looking at them chronologically. A very unique program. Very,
how they all work together to influence culture
and art,
and so forth.
And the organizing idea at the center of the whole thing was the worldview concept from James Sire. Mm-hmm. How should we then live?
Yeah.
And I that was my main bailiwick, was teaching the worldview concept and making charts of all the different worldviews that he organizes. So that was all well, but no, that's a good question, Ryan. The questions have not gone away. And I think if you have serious questions, and if you're in person, I hope this doesn't sound like bragging, but all my life I have felt like I'm trying to be a person of integrity.
Right.
And my outside is going to reflect what I am on the inside. And these questions, they did not go away. Now, some of them were answered, but then new ones took the place. But the questions all got more intense. So I was looking for conservative answers. I joined I forget the name of it now, but the Young Earth Creationists.
Okay, right, yeah.
I had been charismatic. I went away from that for several reasons. But so I tried the Pentecostal charismatic closeness to God, the scientific Young Earth creationism. I read the Genesis flood.
Yeah, right.
Morris.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And then in Scripture, I embraced inerrancy when that whole debate came out, and no, the Bible is inerrant and all that. But that did not make the questions go away, and certainly not when I was at the University of Chicago. That's where I was accepted, and that's where I did my PhD work. At that time, I did not realize it, guys, and this is a little bit bragging. I admit to it. Okay, I admit.
All right, this is the bragging time. We'll put some music behind this.
We have a special filter that comes up.
Special filter now, the bragging filter.
Alert,
he's bragging.
Yeah. Well, at that time, I did not know it, but University of Chicago was rated #1 in America in theology.
Okay, yeah.
Over Harvard, Princeton, Yale, because they were bringing in European scholars, Paul Ricoeur and Hans Kuhn, and they had amazing German scholars and French scholars that they were bringing in. Well, that's a heyday, and that's when I was a student.
And it was kind of a particular bent of theology as well. You know what I mean? Like they had a particular perspective. Yeah.
It was a radical form of theology, but Martin Marty was there. He was on my dissertation committee. And Martin Marty was a Lutheran, and he was he was not too far from being, an evangelical. I wouldn't call him evangelical.
He wouldn't call himself evangelical.
No, he was Christian Century.
Yeah, a long time editor of a magazine called the Christian Century, which was a little bit more to the left of the theological.
But Langdon Gilkey, that was my major professor in theology, and I wrote my dissertation for those guys. So just reading and all that, and just growing as a student and a teacher, a professor, and realizing this whole conservative biblical thing is my worldview, but it's my worldview. That's how I see the world. So I need to be aware. I've got lenses on that are coloring things this way.
Yeah.
So actually, James Sire somewhat had an odd backfire effect, like me thinking, well, this is, there are other ways to look at this, and I'm just seeing the LCU,
the lens. Yeah, you've got one worldview, and there's different
the restoration lens view, right? But my dissertation, and this is, I think, was helpful, might be something useful. I wrote on Peter L. Berger, a sociologist of religion. He wrote The Sacred Canopy, A Rumor of Angels. And those are the two books I focused on because in The Sacred Canopy, he writes as a sociologist of religion, and religion is purely a human projection.
Right.
And takes a strong position that we live in a meaningless universe. We want meaning. We will project meaning in a kind of Feuerbachian way. We project meaning. And then, as a follow-up to his own book, he writes A Rumor of Angels. Mm-hmm. And he says, I'm uncomfortable with my scientific findings as a sociologist. And so as a Lutheran theologian, he writes A Rumor of Angels, and he finds, I think, 5 signals of transcendence.
Yeah. That's so interesting. We've been talking about this quite a bit and reading about it ourselves. This idea that our society and kind of our unspoken worldview as a culture, I'm saying, is in a very immanent physical place where nothing outside of there's no transcendence, right? There's this idea, and yet this is again Charles Taylor and some of the others that followed him have this idea that there's this echo or we're haunted by transcendence. We can't get away from these moments, like you said, these signals that Berger writes about, and
right.
That's
well,
interesting.
Berger ties into phenomenology, and phenomenologically, that's hard to say. Yeah. But phenomenologically, that's what you're talking about. There is a deep human part of our deep humanity that needs meaning, wants meaning, searches meaning, believes there is meaning, or we wouldn't get married, we wouldn't raise children, we would just all commit suicide.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, but studying, especially, I was at the university, I had classes on Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And Friedrich Nietzsche is dynamite. He's a brilliant man until he went insane. But he's a brilliant...
Until he drove himself insane.
Well, he did. He drove himself insane.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
But Feuerbach and David Friedrich Strauss, and I read all the radical, critical David Thomas Hobbes and, those guys. Schweitzer, whom I enormously admire, but The Search for the Historical Jesus. And the more I studied and did my entrance exams, which involved reading 50 scholarly books in all areas, and then my exit exams, and involved much more reading again, all of that resulted that when I started teaching at Lincoln, I already was in a precarious position where that inwardly, I kept it to myself, but I had these questions, Ryan, that you raised. Yeah, and they had been sharpened to a needle point at Chicago. And at the same time, I had made a contract with the school. I'm not going to rock the boat of these students. I was teaching in the college.
Right.
And so I was very careful how I raised my issues and all that. And then when I could make the transition to the seminary, Doc Strauss had gotten really sick in 1990 and survived. We all thought he was dead. They gave him electric shocks, I think 20 or 30 of them. And he survived, but he was not himself. And he could not retire. So for 2 years, I carried him. And that's just how it is. I would lecture and he'd sit in the class with me, but he was there.
Yeah.
And then the seminary voted me full-time in the seminary as his successor, which was an enormous honor. But all that time that I was teaching in the seminary, on the side, the studies I was doing that's why I did not publish. I don't have any publications. I have
Right.
articles,
Right. Right.
but I don't have any publications because I couldn't with integrity write things that our constituents wanted to hear, needed to hear, wanted Lincoln Bible Institute and
Right.
Lincoln Christian College and Seminary. They wanted us to be saying, and in my heart of hearts, I did. I joined the Journal of Evangelical, what's that?
ETS,
ETS,
Evangelical
right.
Theological
Yeah, I was
Society.
a member of ETS until they had a real showdown on inerrancy.
Inerrancy, yeah.
And that's when I pulled out. I thought,
Yeah.
okay, I lectured on inerrancy. I taught about that. And that's not how I experience God's word.
Okay.
And so I consciously decided not to attend ETS anymore. But these questions kept growing. And when I retired, well, there's another factor that comes into this. In 2001, I felt a strong need to draw closer to the Lord, but my reading was not bringing me closer to God. I thought I need Christian fellowship. And so I did an interim ministry in Payne, Illinois, for just briefly. And then Lincoln Christian Church came free. Tom Hertz needed a sabbatical, and the church asked me for the second time if I would supply the pulpit, and I did. And then that became a possibility to become full-time. And so for 5 years, I was preaching at Lincoln Christian Church. And as I started to reveal some of my questions, for instance, once on preaching on prayer, I said, I really struggle with prayer because I had some real deistic ideas.
Right.
God, there is a God, he created things, okay.
It doesn't really affect
He
our
doesn't
day-to-day.
really answer our prayers because my wife and I had prayed earnestly, but we first were married for children, and others were having children and flushing them down the commode and the horrible things. And I once confessed that in the IDS class. First time I opened up, I said, actually, I lectured on deism, and I said, actually, I can get into that because a personal creator God who always answers our prayers. I'm not seeing it, guys. So I had said it from the pulpit, and then something else that's not needed here. But I had started to open up and show integrity in my preaching, and a member of the church, a respected member of the church in 2006, came and said, if you feel that way, you shouldn't be our preacher. And I realized then that there's a certain line of thinking that they wanted to hear, and they deserved to hear. I mean, it was, Lincoln Christian Church and Leon Apple and Hargrove Heritage, but that I maybe didn't fit into that. And so I resigned.
Okay.
And that was hard, physically, emotionally, spiritually. I went through a time of where I couldn't sleep. I had panic attacks because I saw what was looming.
Right.
And what was looming was, when I retired, I stepped away from the faith for a little while. I didn't quit going to church, but I quit taking communion. I quit singing. The preaching was not helping me. I was active in a Sunday school class simply because I liked the teacher, and I was editing his notes and passing them out to people.
Right.
But I had checked out. And so my wife, for her own reasons. Marie was for her own reasons apart from that. And then another thing happened, almost similar to the first call back into the faith with my dad's heart attack. I was very close to having my own heart attack. And in 2014, the same year I retired, I had double bypass heart surgery. And this was amazing to me, and looking back now, when I woke up out of the surgery and all that and was starting to get back with it and eat and try to walk and all that, I felt this enormous wave of gratitude. And it was toward the nurses and the doctors here in Springfield at Memorial. I think it was at Memorial, it might have been St. John's. But it could not be satisfied with just these people. I was grateful for someone bigger, someone larger, someone deeper.
Right.
And so I turned back to the faith again. Second apostasy,
Yeah.
second reconversion. And this time I said, I know what my trouble is. It's all been intellectual. It's all been this radical thinking, philosophical apologetics and all that. I need to get my heart right with God. So for 6 months, I did devotions. Guys, that was the first time in my life I had done devotions.
Right. Because your approach had been more of an intellectual.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
So from 2015, from January till about July, I think, every morning, 45 minutes of prayer, of Bible reading, of devotion reading, of really trying to. Neil Wyndham was a real help to me on that.
Yeah.
And I could not silence the questions in my mind as I was reading scripture. I was reading them for devotional purposes, for upbuilding purposes, for Sarah Young purposes.
Right.
I'm now doing devotions, reading Sarah Young. And that's all nice and sweet and all that, but there's other things,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And so, once again, downhill with my faith, the second time, downhill. And in 2019, I decided, this is it. I'm done. And I was very active in my Sunday school class. I'd been attending church, but like I said, in my heart of hearts, I wasn't singing, wasn't taking Lord's Supper, not participating in any activities, actually, just attending. And but I was done. 2019, my wife and I withdrew from the church. And then something else happened. This wasn't my father's heart attack. This wasn't me having open heart surgery. It was my wife having ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, in 2020, 1920. And so for 22 months, I became her caregiver, sole caregiver. We had hospice come in and check on her, but there was no one else. It was me. I bathed her. I fed her with the stomach tube. I suctioned her because she couldn't, Alzheimer's, not Alzheimer's, ALS. Yeah, makes it so you can't swallow and all that. That's why she couldn't eat. I had to feed her, bathe her, do all that stuff, pick her up, she was more and more falling. And it would take something really, really a tremendous, I call it a miracle. It would take a miracle to bring me back to the faith, but I think that's what happened. Once I was in our shower washing Marie's feet, and unbidden, the image of Jesus washing Peter's feet came to mind. And it just hit me. And looking back, you tried to sort out what's the sequence of thoughts, and you invent maybe, but it just struck me. No one would make up a story of a son of God coming down to earth and taking a towel and washing our feet. No Jew would ever think of Messiah that way. And, who would think of a king or of a divine being doing that? And that really struck me. Right at about that time, there was something else that struck me. And I think that was the first thing that struck me. The second thing that struck me was about 2 months before Marie died. I worked with her for 22 months. The last 2 months, she needed me almost constantly in bed in the night to get up. She would fall and she couldn't get herself up. Bathing, feeding, suctioning, and all that. And I had a library, and you'll appreciate this, Brian, 100 of my best books I saved for retirement.
Right.
They were calling me, read me. But I couldn't. I had to serve her. And I decided these books have got to go. So I put them all in boxes and took them down to Forsyth, to the book barn. I kept 2 books, 2 Bibles, and got rid of my whole library. Oh. I emptied my library. Right. only to think of Philippians 2, where Jesus emptied himself to become our servant. And that was the nail that nailed it, man. I thought, Lord, I'm not, it's not argumentation that's convincing me. It's my heart being touched. And this story touches me. I'm sorry I'm being a baby here. I'm crying, but you know, I cannot, it's hard to share this.
I am too.
Yeah, I see it, man. But it's a miracle, and I just rejoice. I thank God for it. With all my education and all that, the answers did not lay in more study and all that, because my mindset was, the more studies I did, the more apologetics I read. And I even read Tim Keller, really studied him twice, loved Tim Keller. And William Lane Craig, I studied him to some degree, but there's a great man of God. But whatever I read or they said turned into ammunition for me. But when God touched my heart, that changed it. And so that evening that this all came together, I had just got an email from Dan Clymer that Linda had a brain tumor. And I had just gotten an email that same day from Chuck Sackett that he was facing cancer. And I had not prayed in 6-7 years. Actually, really prayed. I, faked it. But I broke down and prayed. And I connected with God in a special way. And as soon as I came out of the prayer, I thought, this is dumb. Tomorrow's Sunday morning. I need to go worship him. So I wasn't quite ready to go back to Lincoln Christian Church. So I went to Trinity Episcopal, where Chris Simpson was the pastor. And reciting the Apostles' Creed with the guys there, people in the church, and knowing I believe this. Going forward and not just commemorating an emblem of the body of Jesus Christ, but partaking of the emblem, partaking of Jesus Christ, of his body. This is my body. And going, well beyond Restoration Movement teaching, or even evangelical, even Protestant teaching. I don't see myself as a Catholic, but to me there was something there. There was a there when I partook of the wine and the bread. Calvin would call it a spiritual reality. Luther would call it consubstantiation. I don't think of it as transubstantiation like Roman Catholics explain using Aristotle, but he died for me.
It's a transcendence. Whatever we call it, it's an experience with the transcendent God.
That's right, right. And that's what I needed. I needed an experience. I didn't need an argument. I needed an experience. So I'm going to wrap it up like this. And then any questions you guys have. But when I was still when I was doing my studies at Chicago, I really got into Immanuel Kant. And Kant wrote a book, What is Enlightenment? And in that book, he says, he challenges Christians. And he says, you need to be enlightened. You need to use your reason. God gave you your reason. So dare to know. Dare to know. Well, my fundamentalist, very conservative upbringing was, no, don't dare to know. Don't ask questions. Don't go there. Don't read those books. Don't listen to those speakers. And I've learned that is not the right answer. The right answer is dare to not know. Be humble. Don't be arrogant like Job. God owes me an explanation. God tells Job, I'm God. You're Job. And I so needed that. I don't think anyone who knew me at school, including you, Brian, would ever say John is an arrogant guy.
No.
That was not how I carried myself. But in my heart of hearts, I had questions that no one could answer, and I was the Lord of my own little existence. And I had to be humbled in serving Marie to dare to say, there's things I do not know, are not for me to know, and I can live with that. So my bottom line is this, guys. There are questions I have learned that I can live with.
Okay.
But there are answers in the Bible and from God that I can't live without.
Oh, okay. Right.
And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, thank you. That's incredible. That I don't have too many questions. I mean, you've a couple of things I mentioned already. Just you can't, at least I can't, with my worldview, with my lens, I can't help but see God's guidance. Like I said, even way back with your family, and if things had been just a little bit different, Don Sharp had not been in the office that day when you called. I mean, or
my father and Don Sharp not connecting that they never did find that long address.
Finding that letter, that all those just are remarkable when you hear your whole story. The other thing, the day you were talking about when you heard from Dan Clymer about his wife, and you heard from Chuck Sackett, two colleagues you'd worked with a long time, the quote from C.S. Lewis came to mind about that God speaks to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our pain, that it's God's megaphone.
I hadn't thought of that, but that's exactly right.
It's in those vulnerable moments, and then the word surrender. Basically, that's what it became an issue of surrendering, and that I'll never think of that passage about washing Peter's feet again without hearing your testimony there. I thank you for that. So,
I have one question for you. Yes, so part of this podcast, Brian and I talk to people about read, get context, jump into it, and sometimes that can lead to further questions. So in your mind, having gone through this experience, your life and your testimony, how do you see that balance of digging into Scripture, trying to understand it, but then also, education, at least the vein of theology, that the biblically critical theology that started with Bultmann and, through that, how do you see education and faith, how do you see them? Do you see them as dualistic, as they're fighting with each other, or I don't know. I'm just you understand that question?
I understand your question, and I don't know how to phrase it any better. You're right on target. For me, what it boils down to is Dallas Willard. His kind of writings have been helpful. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And those two are not enemies, but they are wed, and they are very intimate with each other. But often in academics, we so stress knowledge. Learn the Greek, learn the Hebrew, learn these philosophical moves and all that. And wisdom gets kind of left behind. I'm married again now. God put just a wonderful woman in my life, Karen Hargis. She's now Karen Castelein. 10 months as of today.
Congratulations.
Yeah. And I hope this doesn't get broadcast.
Just between us.
Just between us. I know a lot more about the Bible than she does. I mean, just as a matter of fact, and she's been a Bible student for all her life. Yeah. She does devotions every morning, 5:00. But what I have more as Bible knowledge pales in comparison to the wisdom she has.
Okay.
And so that's how I balance it. Yes, I try to let God be God and answer the big questions, and the questions I cannot avoid. I now can go in prayer to him and just say, Lord, this is in your hands, but make me wise, listen and accept. And for me, Bob Ray said this: God is God and Bob is
Bob. He said that a lot. Yeah.
He said that a lot. And I always thought that was droll and funny. But the man had a lot of wisdom, and that's what I had to learn.
And I think you're right. I think there is a place for us to. The way you summarized it, to basically saying there's things in the Bible that you can't live without. There's answers there that are meaningful to you. Is getting at that too. I think it's good. Yeah.
Well, Nietzsche is very, very powerful if you've read Nietzsche. And, even a Kurt Vonnegut, who's but any nihilist, as Americans say, but I'm Latin trained, nihilist. But it's a very powerful worldview. And I think, this is a word for the people watching and listening. Many of the people who would listen to this would probably be grandparents or parents.
Right.
And so many of our children are being seduced away from a biblical worldview, and they're not given values, and so it's hedonism, but what it results in is a nihilistic worldview. I don't care,
Yeah, it reminds me, I was just reading Nancy Pearcey, who is a contemporary of Francis Schaeffer. She wrote a book. I mean, it's several years old. It was called Saving Leonardo, and it's about the Western culture and all that stuff. But she talked about there had been a study done at that time that, it was about children leaving the faith. And it was for children that did stay in the faith, one of the things that was in common is they had a place to ask questions, where they had.
And they were safe.
And they were safe to ask those questions. And so, I'm thinking back to your story, you've got this education, you've got your parents and you've been baptized and you're going to church, but then you've got the other side, the school where you're learning Rudolf Bultmann. and so
that's
you've got
why I dug way back there, because these things, these tensions develop very early on. And when you're trying to be a person of integrity, and I would say this, in fact, I have several people now that have contacted me and said, based on your faith story, we won't talk to you. So, former students. That when you're really seeking integrity, there is that part that is asking these questions. And these are not dumb and silly and, immoral questions. These are good questions. And many of them have answers, but many of them do not have answers. So dare to not know.
John's got a really incredible story. Like, even as I was listening to that, I enjoyed it again. I was in the room, I'm listening to this, but to go back and listen to it again, you hear some of the things in the story. It's impactful, it moves you. Was there something for you, Brian? I know we've kind of talked about this a little bit recently, but even as you've listened to it again and thought about it, is there anything that really stuck out to you as you listen to this?
Well, I mentioned some things, during the conversation itself, and I'll be with you. Every time I hear that, it makes me emotional again. I thought the second time I listened to it, it would be like, but every time I've listened to it since, it's the same things have really struck me. It's an incredible testimony. I mean, sweeping story. I told John afterwards that he should really write a memoir because, the story is just a fascinating story. That French resistance and Nazis and a love story. All these things.
It's Indiana Jones, a little bit.
It's a pretty interesting story. The only thing I thought was really interesting is you and I have talked a little bit, Ryan, about the way that this connects with some of the other things we've been talking about. The very first episode this season where we talked a lot about, this kind of idea of the secular age in which we live. Taylor's book that we've talked about and referenced several times. The interview that we had not too long ago with Andrew Root. All those it's amazing how much it's fitting together and how much it helps us understand his story. All the learning and all the education, everything that he had, it was really the experiential, emotional, transcendent. The impact that he had, the connection with the transcendent. I'll say this. I haven't said this to you yet, Ryan, but him mentioning the Lord's Supper and how meaningful that was to him as well. I've been thinking about that a lot. I think we need to have another discussion on the Lord's Supper at some point in the future. I think that would be a good episode. But I think this is one in this age when there are so many how do I say this? Celebrity Christians who are going through this process of deconversion, and there's all of these people are emphasizing, the number of people who are walking away from the faith, the nuns, and everything we've talked about. It's for me encouraging to hear someone who went through that
process of deconversion, but then was led back to the faith and recognized that there were things in the faith. I think for me, the statement, and I mentioned this, the statement that he made, that there were things in the faith that he could not live without. I think that's what we've got to key in on as the church and emphasize those things, not pale imitations of what the world has offered or what the world does, but what we have as followers of Christ alone to offer because of what God has done for us in Jesus. That's where I think we really need to hone in and to make it key. What about you? What did you come away with?
I think it was one of those last questions I asked him about, going to school and education and that dichotomy of him of knowledge and wisdom, that he had a lot of knowledge but didn't have a lot of wisdom. And so that really stuck out to me, thinking about that he had filled himself with knowledge, and which sowed he was hesitant about any faith. You know what I mean? Like he didn't, like, I can't have that. I've got these seeds of doubt in me. But that when he embraced some wisdom, and that transcendent experience that you talked about, I think it's so important. I had a conversation with someone recently about when was the last time you felt like you had a spiritual experience?
Right.
And so he said, well, in his line of work, he's like, well, he feels like he's battling the spirits of darkness. And I'm like, okay, but what about an experience of God?
Right.
And it was, he's like, it's been a long time, and it was just, but it's the way that we framed things and lived things. But John is the story of, in caring for his wife, he has this transcendent experience that we've talked about before in the past.
As Andrew Root says, and it's in that act of ministry when we empty ourselves as Christ emptied himself for us on behalf of another, that we connect with the cross in that action.
So we didn't plan that with John, that it was going to connect so well with some of the other things we talked about.
We were kind of amazed as he was talking. We didn't really know. I mean, we knew the general outlines of what he was going to say, but this is a long version. I think this is going to be a good episode to share with people. Maybe people who are going through periods of doubt themselves, or maybe others. And I'll say one other thing just for me, and this will be everything I have to say, Ryan, is it did make me think that what you mentioned about this idea of wisdom made me think about, because you were kind of saying, well, is this what we're doing? Is this valuable that we're
right.
Emphasizing knowing about our faith and studying the Scripture? And it really made me think that it requires both, right? We need to dig in and to know what the Scriptures say, and to even be, deal with those critical issues and those kind of things. But at the same time, we need to be doing it within the context of faith, right? It's within that context, I think, that we can really begin to understand in an even deeper way, not only the meaning of our text, but its significance in our life. These are things we can't live without.
Right.
And so that's what I think going forward. I think I'm going to really make sure we kind of focus on that as well.
Yeah. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Brian, it's been good I was so thankful we got to have that conversation, and we've had some chance here to reflect on it as well. But I hope you all enjoy it. Share the episode.
Yes. Yeah. I think this is an important one. I really do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're hopefully to get some more guests on here soon as well. But
working on a few things.
Yeah, absolutely. So share and let us know what you think. And if not, we will. If we don't hear from you, we'll see you next Tuesday as we. Next week is Easter. Are going to be an Easter episode for us. I believe
that's
so.
Right. I think so.
Yeah, either that or Leviticus.
We're in podcast time.
Either that or Leviticus. We'll find out. All right. So thanks, Brian.
Bye.
Bye.